Hi, today we're going to talk about Procapture. Now, I've been a great fan of Procapture since the first Olympus camera that I bought, which was the OM-1 Mark II. It was just a fantastic feature. And then I had the M1X camera body. Well, now we've moved on to the OM-1 and it's become a whole new ball game. It is so much better to be able to use the Procapture in combination with the bird detection autofocus. Combining those two features together, and it makes it even more incredible. In the M1 Mark II or the M1X camera body, it didn't always manage to autofocus and you only had 18 frames per second. With the OM-1 you've got continuous autofocus at 50 frames per second, plus that ability of that bird tracking to be able to follow a bird and keep it in focus. So my success rate has gone through the roof. Now Procapture is really starting to take off now. It's July 22 as I'm talking, and it's now been introduced into Canon cameras, Nikon cameras, Fuji, and it's been on Panasonic for quite a while in a slightly different format to the Olympus. So it's only really that Sony haven't got it, and I think we can expect that they will pretty soon. It's such a popular feature. I better explain what Procapture is. Not everybody's going to know. It's the ability to take a picture that has occurred before you fully depress the shutter release button. And the way it works is when you half depress the shutter release button, as if you're going to autofocus and start the light metering off, the camera starts to take pictures and it doesn't write them to the memory card. It only puts them into a temporary buffer, and you can specify how many pictures it puts into that buffer, just as you can specify the frame rate, how many frames per second. But let's say, as a typical situation for me, I'm taking 50 frames per second and I have it set up to put 30 pictures into that buffer. So it's got the last 30 pictures, and when the 30 is full up, it just overwrites the oldest picture all the time. When you fully depress the shutter release button, it now writes those 30 pictures that were taken before you've pressed that button. It will write them to the memory card, as well as pictures after you've pressed the button. Now on the OM-1 there are three settings for Procapture. You've got Procapture, then Procapture SH1 and Procapture SH2, and they're just three different speeds. At Procapture you only get 20 frames per second, Procapture SH2 gives you 50 frames per second, and then SH1 120 frames per second maximum for all of them. But I'm using Procapture SH2 most of the time because that gives me continuous focus. If you go up to the higher frame rate, the 120 frames per second, you don't get continuous autofocus. Now in Procapture SH2 mode at 50 frames per second continuous focus, there's only a limited number of OM lenses that will work. This is the list, and I'll put this list in the description underneath the video too. If you're using any other lens, including Panasonic, such as the 100-400, it will still work, but only at 25 frames per second maximum speed. So let's go into the camera menus and look at the settings we need to apply. Starting off with camera setting 1 up in the top left hand corner, and then we need to scroll through to page 7 of the camera 1 settings. So on page 1 here, page 2, 3, 4, all the way through to 7, and the one we're interested in is sequential shooting settings. You've got the settings for all the different options here: mechanical shutter at the top, then silent electronic shutter, SH1, SH2, and then the three that we're interested in on the bottom. Procapture, make sure you don't accidentally untick this box, else it will disappear from the menus where you select Procapture later. Scroll off to the right hand side, and now we get the various settings. Maximum frames per second is set to 20. You can reduce that, but we won't. We'll leave it at 20 frames per second. And now let's jump down to the frame count limiter first. That's set to 50. That's the maximum number of pictures you're going to take when you fully depress the button. It will stop at 50 pictures. Some of them before you've pressed the button and some afterwards. So there's 50 on the graph below. And this graph is very helpful for making it very clear as to what you're doing. So it's a total of 50, but it's made up of 10 pictures before you press the button and then 40 pictures after you press the button. a total of 50. So now if we go to the pre-shutter frames, we can change that. We'll go up to 20 here. So we've now got 20 pictures before we press the button, and it's reduced the 40 afterwards down to 30 to give us that total of 50. We can change the frame count limiter. We can even turn it off, but I never do that. We can increase it up to a maximum of 99. When I get to 99, it will go back to 2. Yeah, so we come back to 99, we'll leave it at that. So now we've got 20 before, 79 afterwards. We go to pre-shutter frames and we can change that to a maximum of 70, but let's just stop at 30 for now. So that leaves us 30 before and 69 afterwards, making our total of 99. So we'll change the pre-shutter frames up to the maximum of 70, giving us 70 before and 29 afterwards. You can have any combination that you wish. Now we come down to ProCap SH1. This can be a maximum of 120 frames per second, but you don't get continuous focus. Only focuses up to the first picture. And it's currently set to 28 pre and 22 after. SH2, this is the one that I'm using almost all of the time. It can be 50 frames per second or 25. I'm normally shooting at 50 frames per second. Pre-shutter frames, I would certainly normally have it higher than 12. So we'll just increase that to 30. And we've got the frame count limiter set to 50. So now we have to select which one of those 3 Procapture options we want. If we're still on page 7 of camera menu 1, we can go up to the drive mode and come across, and we can select ProCap SH2, ProCap SH1 or ProCap. We can also do it from the super control panel. We come down to SH2 and we can change it from there. Or you can press the button top left of the camera, the front button, and the menus will come up that way and you can select them along that line. So that's how you set the camera up. But how many frames should you be setting before you fully depress the button to put into the buffer, and how many afterwards? Now there's no one answer to that question. It's a variable amount, but this is the way that I think about it. I'm shooting at 50 frames per second. Now how long does it take me from the point where my brain is telling me to press that button until I actually press it? Now it's hard to measure, but I think half a second is very generous. I think I can easily fully depress a button because I've already got my finger on the button. I've already got it half depressed. So I think I'm actually very quick to press it. So as I'm going to be shooting at 50 frames per second, half a second is 25 frames. So I typically have it set up for 25 frames in the buffer before I fully depress the button. Now what I find is when I look at my results afterwards, I've usually got quite a few pictures of the bird before it launches into flight. So this juvenile collared pratincoll, I maybe had 3 or 4 frames when it's still sitting there, because I don't really need 25 frames. I'm usually quick enough. But none of us can be that sharp and alert all of the time. So there are occasions when I'm not quite concentrating. I've maybe had to wait 5 minutes for this bird to launch into flight, and I perhaps wasn't as aware as I should have been its launch, and it's taken me longer than half a second. So if I keep it at 25 frames per second, I've got a little bit of leeway there. So we'll just run through this sequence at 50 frames per second. You can see there's not much movement between the wing beats, and that's very good because it means you're likely to capture the perfect wing position. People have several times said to me, you're ending up with too many pictures, it's a lot of editing. It's not a lot of editing if you're using the right software. Something like Breeze Browser or Photo Mechanic, you can whiz through these pictures. You don't have to look at every frame, you just pick the frames where the wing position is best, check it sharp, get rid of the rest. It's very, very quick. So this picture is from a different sequence now, and typically I have a total of 50 pictures in a burst. So I've got 25 before and 25 afterwards, and with a bird launching into the air, that is more than adequate. The bird has usually gone out the frame before I get to the end of the 50. Now this is a different scenario. We have a Kentish plover bathing. Now I know when this bird finishes bathing, it's going to jump up in the air and flap its wings, but it won't just do it once, it will do it several times. So here I would like to extend the total burst of 50 pictures and put it up to 99, because I know this is going to go on much longer. So there are different situations, but typically I have it 25 before and 25 afterwards, and then just occasionally I extend it. And although you don't have to wait for the buffer to empty itself completely before you can take another burst with Procapture, you will eventually fill up the buffer. So something else I'm prone to doing when I'm shooting Procapture is to shoot JPEG, so it can write to the memory card faster and empty that buffer out. So I will shoot at the largest JPEG file rather than the RAW file I would normally shoot. This great spotted woodpecker is a good example where I don't believe with the M1X it would have kept it in focus, but the bird detection on the OM-1 does. But notice here, it's such a fast flying bird, I don't get many perfect wing positions. That one's okay, it's a bit close to the log, that's no good. That one I've clipped the tops of the wings, but perhaps the next wing beat as it comes down will be okay, which it is, and is away from the log, so that's perhaps the best picture. And the next one's no good, and then he's leaving the frame. So you still don't get many pictures at 50 frames per second, and I wouldn't mind 120 frames per second continuous focus. Perhaps that's coming soon. It's useful, in the bottom left hand corner of the picture there's a symbol appears when Procapture is running. You take your finger off, that symbol disappears and it comes back. It's telling you you're writing pictures to the buffer at the moment, otherwise you might not realise it. Procapture actually only runs for 1 minute, after that you have to take your finger off the button and press it again. But it's for the smaller species that Procapture really comes into its own, things like corn buntings and house sparrows. Small birds have always been more challenging to do in flight, but with Procapture it is possible. And Metapipit, you do need faster shutter speeds for small birds, so my starting point of 2500th goes up a bit, that's a siskin, and I might be shooting these at 4,000ths of a second, a lesser red pole. Thanks for watching.